Chapter 30, Broken Mirror. On the morning of July 1st, a hyperwave message was transmitted out from Earth and into the wider galaxy. It was addressed to over 50,000 recipients, ranging from news reporters to politicians to military leaders and religious figures. The Galactic Council, Higaran Diamid, Emerald Institute, Commonwealth National Assembly, Xenonian News, and everyone in between was shown the following text message. The United Nations created a fake Jericho. Etienne's government is using the cult of Jericho to kidnap children on their behalf. The kids are at Cape Canaveral in Florida. UN is drugging kids and doing experiments on them. Many are already dead. Help us, please. UN is building powerful new weapons at same place. Hundreds of children already dead. They are going to kill more. Please help. Paradox infiltrated the ISO. Send the GDF now. My name is Lawrence Ridge. I am in Orlando. We can get GDF into Canaveral. Send help as soon as possible. At the Angel Moon, the Galactic Custodian Marka summoned her council for an emergency meeting. The Partogan Queen had gone through a noticeable change in her appearance. Her face was a little more sallow and gaunt. She also wore a thick scarf around her neck. The Galactic Defense Force was still reeling from its defeat at the planet Amadiio, and people like General McCavity were itching for some payback. More cautious folk, such as the dragon-like advisor, argued that the priority should be the recapture of Amadiio. General McCavity passed around copies of the hyperwave message from Lawrence, demanding action. The humans have been abducting children from all over the galaxy with impunity. This is our chance for real justice, he said. I have already dispatched stealth ships to Earth for reconnaissance, Partogan battlecruisers using cloaking devices. They've been tasked with taking high-resolution photographs of Cape Canaveral and the nearby UN base, Kennedy Space Center. A Blorg admiral raised one slimy appendage and spoke. Sir, this human was pleading for immediate help in his message, but Earth is very far away from the front lines, further now thanks to their foothold on Amadiio. Realistically, how long would it take the GDF to reach Earth? General McCavity brought up a holographic map of the galaxy, focusing in on the United Nations territory. The most direct path to Earth, McCavity explained, is to launch our fleets from the Karos graveyard. From there, we would blow through the enemy's defensive lines at either Wolf 359 or Proxima Centauri. From there, it's a straight shot to Earth. This is assuming the Partogans refuse to let us use a hyperspace core. The dragon-like advisor shook his head. Admiral, you need to remember that 2 of Auraki's hyperspace cores were recently stolen. The Higarans have reclaimed their core, and now the former Bentusi core has fallen into human hands. We have to assume that any attempt to penetrate UN space will be countered by a far-jumping fleet. The Galactic Custodian stood up and walked around the conference table, examining the map closely. Which of those systems is the most poorly defended? She asked. Alpha Centauri, replied the advisor. Human warships in this area were recently used in the Battle of Amadiio. The vessels are damaged, and the crew morale is probably low. We stand a good chance of punching through. Marka furrowed her brow, and as she thought, instinctively raised one hand to her neck. Nobody around the table spoke, but each person snuck a quick look at the scarf wrapped around the custodian's neck, hiding it from view. As she mused to herself, Queen Marka gently slipped her hand beneath the scarf and rubbed the large, gruesome scar at the base of her neck. The wound was not fully healed, and it throbbed with a dull pain. We need to flush out the stolen hyperspace core, Marka said. Advisor, how do you think we would fare in a mass battle, on a similar scale as the last war? Nervous looks and murmurs went around the room. The advisor frowned in thought, his brow furrowed and snout crinkled. Custodian, this is not the Second Hyperspace War. The galaxy simply cannot support that kind of warfare. Vast armadas with hundreds of thousands of starships, I mean. Almost half of all sentient life was killed off in the 2HW. Now there's not enough people left to crew an armada and keep the home front running smoothly. Even if there was, most of the galaxy's military infrastructure is still in ruins. Shipyard Ninra, Tanis Base, Thaddeus Sabah, Naval Base Alpha, they all make for good anchorages, but none of the shipyard facilities are able to perform like they did before 2015. There's also not enough money to go around. The galactic stock market never recovered from their space station being destroyed during the war. The unfortunate reality, Custodian, is that the galactic community won't be able to sustain a large-scale armada until we've fully recovered from the hyperspace war. And that kind of recovery is about 200 years away, maybe more. Even then, our fleets can't get much bigger. The best we can give you is maybe 1,500 warships. As soon as the advisor finished his statement, a MyCore droid tapped the conference table to get everyone's attention. "This group should be made aware of the latest calculations," the droid said. "The central AI of the MyCore Empire has used combat data accumulated over the past 2 years to calculate the exact size of the United Nations military, including the total number of warships, with 99.99% accuracy. Central AI is convinced the human aggressor currently possesses 911 functional warships. Our side has the numerical advantage. In the event of a mass battle between the two combined fleets, we predict the GDF will suffer casualties and losses amounting to 60% of our total force. It will not be possible for the GDF to subdue Earth in the aftermath of such a battle, due to a shortage of both warships and personnel." Marka slipped her hand underneath her scarf again, picking at the gruesome scar on her neck. It was becoming a new nervous habit. Needing time to think, Marka allowed her council to descend into a new debate, arguing over how best to neutralize the human navy. July 3rd, 2086. Arcadia Bay, Oregon. With a great roar of engines, the spaceplane Niagara rose up from the ground and sped away into the night. Progeny soldiers quickly tried to bring their anti-aircraft weapons online, but before they could even swivel the turret, the Niagara was far away, speeding north. As soon as they were airborne, the Stormbreakers relaxed. Nainu simply collapsed in his seat, completely out of strength. Being dead sapped him of energy, and the 2-day hike to Arcadia Bay had nearly killed him a second time. Like her reptilian rescuer, Jericho was also weak. She stumbled back to the crew quarters and looked around before slumping into the first bunk bed she found. "This isn't the Archangel," Jericho mumbled, "but it's the same class. Where am I? And where are you taking me? Not that I'm strong enough to argue." Quarter left Maui and Varian to fly the spaceplane, carrying Nainu into the crew quarters. "You're aboard the USS Niagara," Quarter explained. "For now, we're just trying to get away from the Progeny and the UN. They were both after you." Quarter trailed off, unsure of what to say. Jericho groggily finished the sentence. "They wanted to exploit me, just like XCOM all those years ago," Jericho said. "And what about you?" "No, never," Nainu said. He tried to dismount from Quarter's paws, but ended up falling to the floor next to Jericho's bunk. Resting his back against the cold metal frame, he looked up at her and carried on. "We didn't know you were in there. All we knew was that Freeman and Hyatt were fighting over a source of power. They both wanted it for their own purposes. We wanted to stop that from happening." Quarter was not convinced by Nainu's words, and she was about to open her mouth to say something else when Jericho stopped her. "No need for convincing," Jericho said. "Did you forget I can read minds? Your little friend is very sincere and honest. You've got a few mental barricades and defenses in your mind, Quarter. You would have noticed if I broke in, so I peered into Nainu's mind instead." Instead of blushing, Nainu hid his face in his hands, while his whole body changed color, becoming pale. Jericho gave him a very warm smile. She looked very tired, but sat up in the bunk, pushing herself to stay awake and keep talking. "Hey," she started to say slowly, "one of your teammates seems really familiar to me, like I've met him before. Can I talk to the human who was with you?" Quarter nodded, and then she walked to the hatchway and called up to the fuselage. "Hey, Varian, can you come back here?" At the mention of Varian's name, Jericho's eyes widened. Nainu saw this and started to feel excited. A moment later, Varian entered the cramped living space. He, or she, nervously looked around and waved meekly at Jericho. "Hi. It's been a long time," Varian said. Moving with the energy one would not expect from a 70-year-old woman, Jericho rose, crossed the room, and wrapped her arms around Varian in a motherly hug. "You've grown so much!" Jericho's voice was full of joy. "You were just a little toddler last time I saw you." Quarter and Nainu both dropped their jaws. From the fuselage, Setla and Kingi both shouted, "Wait a minute! You've met before?" Jericho released Varian and folded her arms in front of her, gazing at Varian in delight. "About 15 years ago, before Etienne came to power, I would go to the annual War in Heaven reunion with the other veterans," Jericho explained. "Blake and Chihiro would attend every year, and they brought their kids and grandkids. I remember Himawari trying to stop you and your stepsister from climbing up the tall tree across from the amphitheater." "I remember falling out of that tree and breaking my wrist," Varian replied with a half-hearted laugh. "I do remember seeing you there. You were really quiet back then, and you always seemed so sad." Quarter and Nainu were following this conversation intensely. For them, Jericho was a godlike figure who only existed in historical documentaries and museum exhibits. They were having a little trouble accepting the reality that Varian Robinson personally knew Jericho, if only for a brief moment in his or her childhood. However, at this particular moment, the conversation took a turn, and the two Stormbreakers suddenly found it difficult to keep up, as Varian and Jericho started discussing something they were not up to speed with. Jericho stopped talking, and for an awkward few moments, she looked over every inch of Varian's body, her own face going through a wide range of expressions. Jericho seemed to be reading Varian like a book, and then coming to terms with whatever she had learned. "Wow," Jericho said in a quiet voice. "You've changed quite a lot since then. When did you realize something was off?" Varian's face turned red. "Not getting out of this one, huh?" she, or he, said. Varian rubbed the back of their head and went on. "I think I must have been about 5 or 6 years old. You know that weird feeling you get when all of your clothes are the wrong size? It was like that, but with my whole body. Day in and day out and never stopping. You can read minds, right? I'm sure you know the rest of the story." Jericho nodded. "Yes, and I'm sorry you had to stop your treatments to become a Stormbreaker. I really hope you can finish becoming your true self on the outside when this is all over," she said. Then Jericho hugged Varian again and whispered in his or her ear. "I can see you picked a new name. Do you want me to call you that?" "Not yet," Varian replied. "Haven't started using it myself. Besides, the Honolulu Gene Therapy Clinic has probably thrown out all of my hormone treatments and medications by now. I might have to start over from scratch when I get home." Quarter and Nainu watched all of this and were completely lost. Without the ability to read minds, they both knew they were missing some very important context. They were about to make their way to the door and leave when Jericho addressed her next question to them. "In the meantime, Where are you going to take me? I assume you and your teammates have a plan of some kind? Glad to be off a sensitive topic, Varian launched into an explanation. Once I'm sure we're clear of UN forces, we'll send a hyperwave signal to our boss and tell him what's happened. He ordered us to hunt down and kill the Paradox, but we never expected to run across you on the way. This is going to change all of our plans. Nainu and Quarter nodded. He's right, Nainu said. You're a game changer, Jericho. Everything is different now. I think you mean she's right, Jericho said. Let's call your boss and make a new plan. I fought the Paradox before, and I know what she's capable of, so I'm certain I can help you. All 6 of the Stormbreakers and Jericho gathered together in the fuselage. While the Niagara flew across the Pacific on autopilot, Maui set up a hyperwave call. Under the light of the hologram emitters, Quarter realized that Jericho's outfit, a simple yellow dress, was looking worn out and dirty. Quarter swatted the fabric with her tail just as the call was completed. I know our boss is going to need more time to process all of this, Maui said, so I committed a causality violation. I bounced our hyperwave signal all over the galaxy before routing it back to Earth. So he's going to be in the past, relative to us. As the call was connected, the ship's computer said today's date and time. 5:51 a.m. Wednesday, July 3rd, 2086. However, for the person answering the call, today's date and time was 7:45 a.m. Sunday, June 30th, 2086. The hologram coalesced in the middle of the crew quarters, a vague humanoid figure deprived of any identifying physical features. No one could tell anything about this person aside from the fact that he was a man. From any angle, his body was shadowed as though there was a strong source of light behind him. Good morning, Stormbreakers, said the Shadow Man. I trust you have an update regarding Arcadia Bay. We have lots of news on that front, Varian said. Open hostilities between the UN and the Progeny have started up. Also, Erin Hyatt is dead. You can find her body in Oregon's Crater Lake. Excellent, said the Shadow Man. Both of these developments can be used to our advantage. Did you recover the source of psionic power the UN or Progeny were seeking? Varian pointed to his or her left. The Shadow Man turned to look at Jericho. The old woman gave a weak smile before looking at the floor. To the surprise of everyone aboard the Niagara, the Shadow Man showed a visible reaction. He took half a step backward at the sight of Jericho. It was obvious that he instantly knew who he was looking at, and he reacted quickly. Where are you now? The Shadow Man demanded. Pacific Ocean, heading northwest toward the Aleutian Islands, Varian said. The Shadow Man's body twisted as though he was speaking to someone who was not there. In fact, he was giving orders to somebody who was in the same room as himself. The Stormbreakers simply could not hear him. After a moment, the Shadow Man returned to the hyperwave call. This is a sea change. We must move quickly, and act just as quickly. Jericho, the time for friendly greetings and introductions will have to wait. Are you fit for space travel? I can fly, Jericho said, but no high-gravity worlds, please. I'm not as young as I used to be. The Shadow Man nodded, then spoke to the Stormbreakers. Get away from Earth, he said. Once you are clear, take Jericho to the Genna asteroid field. Dig Site 603. I will summon my allies and meet you there. July 10th, 2086. Hyperspace. En route to the Great Wastelands. The Higaran pirate ship Ashoka and her escort fleet were in the midst of their 15th hyperspace jump in the past 10 days. Almost 2 weeks had gone by since Ashoka's dramatic escape from Amadiio with Erubik on board, but the situation was still a dire and urgent one. While waiting out each jump, the ship's crew were locked inside of radiation shelters. and inside one of those pressurized chambers, the newest addition to the Ashoka's complement was bringing everyone up to speed on the crisis at hand. Irabik belonged to the avian Ozcock species, and she was also a powerful member of the Galactic Council. She had been taken aboard the Ashoka after her own expedition to the Galactic Rim ended with a shocking discovery. She retold the story of her recent adventures to her rescuers. The pirate crew perked up at the news of an undiscovered empire in the Galactic Rim, excited by the possibility of exotic plunder. Himawari Robinson was paying very close attention, aided by sign language translation from Amako Padariki. "A machine empire?" Hali repeated. "Like the Mycor." "This is different," Irabik said, shaking her head. "These automatons are operating without any kind of input from organic life forms like you or me." "That sounds disturbing," Runhan said. "Next time we're out by the Galactic Rim, we'll drop some buoys and rig them to transmit warning messages." "Good idea," Irabik said. "In the meantime, you will take me to Ninagai." Amako Padariki, who had been translating the conversation into sign language for Himawari's benefit, did a double take, staring open-mouthed at Irabik. The Kingdom of Ninagai was a small star nation and founding member of the Levakian Confederation, a member state of the Partogan Levakian Commonwealth. It was located in the Outer Limb, a distant and remote region of space on the very edge of the galaxy. Amako leaned over and hissed into Irabik's ear. "I don't know if you've noticed, but you're on board a pirate ship. Those guys won't take kindly to a member of the Galactic Council giving them orders." Hali and Runhan were standing with their arms folded and nostrils flared. Both women were holding back far more hostile replies. Several of the space pirates in the chamber tried to give the two women extra space. Even Himawari could pick up on the sudden souring of their moods. Irabik, however, remained steadfast. "It doesn't matter who you are," she said. "You have a ship with a hyperspace module, and I need to meet my allies on Ninagai at once. Are you going to change course or not?" "Listen here, bird," Hali said. "You are in no position to give orders. I've got half a mind to call the Galactic Council and ask how much they'll pay for your ransom. But if you're going to be this tedious, I'll just put you off the ship instead. How does the tomb world of Blorg sound? Or maybe the Partogan grave world?" Irabik looked very annoyed. "I do not have time for this," she said. "I need to speak to my contacts on Ninagai as soon as possible. Once we drop out of hyperspace, I'll take my leave." Irabik started to pack up her possessions, including the progenitor oracle. Hali and Runhan both started to interject, but Himawari tapped Irabik's wing to get her attention. Irabik looked at Himawari and was confused by her rapid-fire hand signals. What is this, a code?" Irabik said. No, Amako cut in. "She's deaf. This is how she talks. Hold on." Amako focused on Himawari and started to translate. "I think you should reconsider," Himawari said through Amako. "The planet Ninagai is in the Levakian Confederation, and it's on the other side of the Great Wastelands. That place is controlled by tyrannic raiders, and as far as pirates go, they're a lot worse than Hali's crew." Hali scoffed. "Unlike the tyrannic raiders, I pay my crew with money," she said. Dozens of the surrounding pirates cheered loudly at this, a few of them waving various banknotes over their heads, such as Partogan dirhams, Higaran rupees, and UN credits. Himawari went on. "You might stand a better chance of getting through aboard another pirate ship. We might be your only chance, especially if time is really against you," she concluded. Reluctantly, Irabik admitted to herself that she needed to cross the Great Wastelands quickly, and if she did so through official Galactic Council channels, the journey would take nearly a month. For a moment, Irabik considered transmitting her findings in a hyperwave message, but she quickly shelved the idea. The Levakians would not know what to look for based on Irabik's description alone. This was something she needed to do in person. Feathers ruffled, Erubik turned to face Hali and Runhan again. "Let's make a deal," Erubik offered. "What could I, a senior diplomat of the Ozcox diaspora and sitting member of the Galactic Council, give in return for rapid passage to the Levakian kingdom of Ninigai?" Reflexively, Hali held up a hand and said, "I'll do it for 50 million dirhams, all in advance." But before she could finish her sentence, Runhan grabbed Hali by the shoulder and pulled her back. Both women engaged in a hushed conversation, and everyone leaned in close, trying to hear what was being whispered. Finally, the pair nodded in agreement and gave their response. "We'll take you to Ninigai," Runhan said. "But in return, we want the Galactic Council to commission my wife as a privateer." Erubik blinked. Why?" Hali thumped her own chest. "Because my fleet just threw down with the UN Navy, and if anyone is going to pay for repairs, for treating the wounded and burying the dead, it had better be the nearest Earth ship. With a privateer commission, it would be so much easier to enforce payment." "And if you say no," Runhan said, "you will be the one paying for our damages, with the charity money your people are getting from the Blorg." "Ah, you know about that," Erubik said, looking around at the very greedy pirates in the room with her. "So that's the ransom you mentioned earlier. I didn't think you were serious." "Pirate," Runhan said, with a smirk on her face and a hand on her laser pistol. July 15th, 2086. Greater Manchester, United Kingdom. The UN fleet, battered but victorious, returned to Earth. The conquest of Amadiio was a cause for celebration, and as the starship Stellaris glided to a pinpoint landing at the spaceport in Manchester, Inez could see fireworks lighting up the night while tens of thousands of people flooded the streets. The megacity was alive and noisy, despite it being 3 o'clock in the morning. Horns sounded, people shouted, lights flashed, and Inez could tell at once that this scene was repeating itself all over UN territory. The Stellaris did not stay for long. They were only here to pick up a team of engineers who would set to work repairing the Divine Enforcer. The weapon was badly damaged following its single use against Amadiio. After a few hours on the ground, Stellaris lifted off and started the return trip to Cape Canaveral. The victorious fleet broke up here as the various warships returned to their home bases. The French battleship Charlemagne stayed in high orbit. She was so badly damaged that entering the atmosphere was simply not an option. Her repairs would be carried out at Port Armstrong, near Jupiter. The Singaporean destroyer Vengeance escorted Stellaris away from the UK before turning toward Alpha Centauri. Before long, Stellaris was crossing the Atlantic alone. On the bridge, Inez was starting to feel anxious. It had been 2 weeks since the Battle of Amadiio, and she had not made sense out of what happened that day. Like any good commander should, Inez ordered her subordinates to write an after-action report, detailing everything she needed to know about what happened during the battles of Polaris and Amadiio. Scarlett Freeman was still aboard the ship, and she had told Inez that the AARs were a good idea, and that she wanted to read them as well. Scarlett said this in a tone that suggested it was not a polite request. For the trip across the Atlantic, Inez had used her own authority to bar Scarlett from the bridge. Officially, her excuse was that the bridge crew must not be distracted during their landing preparations. In reality, Inez wanted as much distance from her mother as possible. The relationship between the two had noticeably soured, and Inez had no idea what she did to arouse her mother's suspicions. Standing over a waist-high hologram projector on the starboard side of the bridge, Inez looked at a 3-dimensional image of the Stellaris, peering over the shoulder of her helmsman. Inez was only pretending to inspect the damage to her ship. She was deeply distracted right now. Ever since the Battle of Amadiio, Inez and Cassandra stayed in touch with one another. Even though they only met for a few hours each day, they would share a meal in the cafeteria each morning, where Cassandra would use an extra large glass of water to swallow the strange red pills she was prescribed. Both of them were now aware of the connection that somehow existed between them. Inez had sat down with the little girl and told her about the 2 previous incidents, in which Inez had somehow seen the world through Cassandra's eyes. Together, during their downtime, the 2 girls had downloaded a historical database from Stellaris' onboard computer. Inez had a very strong hunch that she read about this scenario somewhere before, and her hunch turned out to be correct. 50 years ago, during the Second Hyperspace War, there were 2 Stormbreakers, Blake Robinson and Chihiro Tachibana. Both of them were still alive today and active in UN politics. Blake was currently challenging the Secretary General for his job. But back in 2035, he and Chihiro were young soldiers. And just like Cassandra and Inez, they shared a special connection. Blake and Chihiro were joined together by a psionic link. This telepathic connection allowed each person access to the other's mind. The 2 Stormbreakers exploited their psi link for advantages in battle, and in civilian life, they were so inseparable that they were sometimes treated as a single person by friend and foe alike. Reading this story, Cassandra and Inez reluctantly accepted the reality that somehow, against all odds, a psionic link had formed between them. Unlike with the historic Stormbreakers, this new link seemed to be weak and inconsistent by comparison. Inez only had limited access to Cassandra's innermost thoughts, and would only see through Cassandra's eyes if the little girl was upset or emotional. By comparison, Cassandra had never been able to see things through Inez's eyes, and whenever Inez was excited or worked up, Cassandra would perceive it as a sudden feeling of being wide awake and fully energized. "I knew you were having a lot of fun at the beginning of June," Cassandra had said. "Every night, right after I went to bed, I all of a sudden felt like I was too excited to sleep. I felt like I was having a blast doing something fun, even though I was just lying in bed." Hearing this, Inez had racked her brains, trying to remember what she was doing in early June. Then, with a powerful sense of growing embarrassment, Inez realized that Cassandra had telepathically eavesdropped on her date nights with Yaroslav Datsenko. Inez went back and forth with herself, wondering if she should ask how much of these late-night dates Cassandra picked up on. But the youngster was faster on the draw. "If you like that bald soldier so much, why'd you steal his clothes?" Cassandra asked. "Yep, that's enough for today!" Inez ended the talk here. Now, as the Stellaris was on final approach to Cape Canaveral, Inez was distracted. She was thinking about Cassandra and the psionic link between them. Both girls had spent hours guessing at why this connection existed in the first place, but neither could come up with a good answer. Absent-mindedly, Inez focused her mind on Cassandra, who was currently napping in the captain's quarters. This connection always seemed to be so passive. Chihiro and Blake were able to actively use their own psi-link, so why not now? Inez wondered, how do I call Cassandra? Is it like a hyperline, or do I just imagine myself shouting her name? A mental image drifted to the front of Inez's mind. It was herself wandering down an empty corridor and calling out to Cassandra. "Inezi, is that you?" Cassandra's voice filled Inez's ears as though she was standing right in front of her. Inez broke out of her daydream, startled, and accidentally put her hand into the hologram of Stellaris in front of her. The three-dimensional display switched into exploded view, showing each individual part of the engine array like a blueprint. Realizing a few members of the bridge crew were looking at her, Inez played it cool. Central, did the engine control team give us a go for landing yet? She asked. Central Officer Dotsenko looked at a nearby computer screen and said, "No, ma'am. I'll go and see what's taking them so long." Normally, because of her serial romantic nature, Inez would have watched Dotsenko as he left the bridge, appreciating his attractive build until he was out of sight. But just as Inez was starting to eye him up, she abruptly felt as though all of her energy was being sapped away. Inez felt a sudden sense of being weighed down and lost her motivation to do much of anything. All she wanted to do was go back to her quarters, bury her face in a pillow, and cry for hours on end. Somewhere in the back of her mind, a subconscious impulse told Inez that she was not normally a gloomy type of person, and this sudden change in her sense of the world around her was not of her own making. The psionic link was active. Stepping over to the far side of the bridge, Inez leaned against a railing, pretending to read a report on her tablet computer. Now that she was fully aware of the connection, it was almost easy. Inez closed her eyes. Inside the captain's quarters, Cassandra was curled into a ball in the middle of the floor, crying. She was frightened of returning to Cape Canaveral. Dr. Polly Sparks scared her. The big machines in the VAB scared her. And so did Director Freeman and Central Officer Sepulveda. But most of all, she was scared of her inevitable reunion with the other children. Almost 3 weeks had passed since the last time Cassandra had been taken off-world by Director Freeman. In that time, Inez knew that many of the alien children living with her in the pediatric clinic would have died. Cassandra was terrified that some of those children, who she liked and called friends, would be gone forever without ever having said goodbye. Cassandra was frightened, gloomy, and traumatized. As she wept on the floor, her body started to warm up. The temperature in the cabin quickly rose to searing levels, causing plastic dishware on the table to sag and droop. Inez opened her eyes. Panicking, she realized Cassandra was about to lose control and transform. If the Emerald Avatar materialized inside of a cramped starship, no one would survive. Inez looked around the bridge and yelled at the chief of the watch. "Petty Officer Saraki, you have the con. I'll be back." And before the Nigerian man could say anything in response, Inez dashed off the bridge and into the hallway. Fortunately, the captain's quarters were only a short distance away from the bridge. By the time Inez reached it, the hallway was already warming up. Crewmen loosened their uniforms, sweating. One of them saw Inez coming and saw the expression on her face. He became alarmed. "Ma'am, what's happening?" the crewman asked. Inez did not stop to explain. Instead, as she ran past him, she yelled, "Set off the fire alarm! We need the suppression system!" Inez reached her private quarters and tried to open the door. With a gasp, she withdrew her hand. The metal was so hot it had instantly burned her palm. Keeping her now burned left hand close to her chest, Inez slammed her right shoulder to the door, trying to force it. At that moment, a klaxon sounded, and a computerized voice spoke over the intercom. "Fire detected in the captain's quarters. Extinguishing." A loud hissing noise sounded on the other side of the door. Inez took a few steps back and then threw her whole weight against it. This time, the door crashed open. Immediately, Inez was hit in the face by a blast of cold, white gas. The fire in her quarters was already out. The suppression system was venting massive amounts of carbon dioxide into the room, and just before the white gas filled the place completely, Inez spotted Cassandra, grabbed her, and pulled her out of the room. Medics and damage control teams flooded the corridor, making their way to the scene. In the middle of all this hubbub, Inez clutched Cassandra close to her, whispering into her ear, "It's okay. You're okay, Cassandra. You're all right now." Cassandra buried her face in Inez's chest, crying harder than ever. "I don't want to go back! I don't want to go back!" she protested. Inez turned so that the rescue team was behind her. Speaking quietly, she said, "Are you worried about all of the other kids at the Cape?" Cassandra nodded. "It's not fair. Not fair that we get to leave, but they have to stay. They'll probably die there, too." Inez felt a powerful pang of empathy in her chest. Truthfully, she had only thought about escaping with Cassandra and no one else. In fact, the escape plan she and Cassandra worked out did not allow for a third person to join them, let alone the 200 other children kidnapped by the UN. But no matter how much she thought about it, Inez knew that abandoning those kids to die was simply the wrong choice. Was there anything she could do? Anything at all? There was. "Hey, Cassandra," Inez said. "Listen, I have some friends on the outside. At least, I think they're friends. When we get away from Canaveral, we'll go and find them, and ask them to rescue everyone at the Cape, okay?" "You promise?" Cassandra asked, wiping her eyes. "I promise," Inez said. "Swear it on my life, we'll rescue everyone." July 20th, 2086. Cape Canaveral, Florida. 5 days had passed since the warship Stellaris landed at Cape Canaveral. In that time, the Wolverines and their allies were not idle. As soon as Piper returned from infiltrating the UN base, Lawrence used a hyperwave relay to transmit a distress signal to the wider galaxy. Responses had come swiftly. The galactic community became aware of the situation over the course of a week, and while the Wolverines had no way of knowing, this single transmission had radically altered the conduct of the war. Representatives of the Galactic Council sent their replies directly to Lawrence, informing him that a few probes and cloaked ships were doing reconnaissance over Earth, but a larger contingent of the Galactic Defense Force was months away at best. This news was heartbreaking. "There are kids in there!" Sarah screamed when Lawrence relayed the word. "Almost 200 of them! We can't just sit on our hands and wait!" An emergency meeting was held aboard the old warship Kakama, still berthed in the Gray Phoenix scrapyard. Lawrence, Sarah, Piper, and Jay stood on one side of a massive map of central Florida, while opposite them were Shipbreaker Carfu, Crew Chief Marga, General Osmer, Colonel Sharp, and several new allies. A representative of the Andromedon Sanctuary, Corsair the Faceless, Inez Espinosa, Robert Lansing, George Farshti, and a motley collection of local Floridians, both human and alien, who wanted to help. "The Galactic Defense Force can't help us," Lawrence began. "We're on our own." "Corsair and I have been inside the base," Piper added. "We've seen the facility, and we can verify that the UN is holding about 200 children against their will in that place. Also, several teams of Gray Phoenix saboteurs have entered the base. Not all of them returned to us." "There is a dry dock located here," Corsair said, pointing to the Apollo Center on the map. "There is a massive UN Navy operation here. 3 cruisers are being worked on, including the one that blasted Amadiio with the psionic weapon." "So it is true," the Andromedon said in broken English. "Have the Amadi been enslaved?" "It really looks that way," Emmanuel said. Ever since the attack, the people down on Amadiio have been moving to align themselves with the UN as quickly as they can. It's creating a lot of chaos because Amadiio was the capital of the Kunbar Confederation. The rest of their nation is still loyal to the galactic community, while their homeworld is requesting annexation by the UNE. The Amadi nation has basically ceased to exist. Millions of Amadi have been creating local branches of the progeny and cult of Jericho on their planet, Jay added. They're even bringing human acolytes from Altair. At the same time, their old democratic government has been replaced with a theocratic republic. Before the end of the month, Amadiio will be a UN satellite state. Which means, Lawrence said, the UN is about to have a collaborator government on their side, one that will make abducting non-human children much easier for them. We need to shut down this operation in Canaveral tonight. Murmurs. General Osmer stroked his beard in thought. You want us to carry out a frontal assault on Cape Canaveral, which is a fortress defended by Shrike and able to be reinforced within hours by sea, air, and space. What assets do we have on hand? He said. About 120 Americans, Colonel Sharp replied. Most of them from Florida, Georgia, and Alabama. Plus 12 Andromedons, 16 Mutons, 10 Levakians, 8 Vipers, 5 Mechs, 3 Partogans, 1 Tidani, and I'm really proud of this one. We dug up an Advent sectopod out of the scrapyard. It's beaten up, but it still works. General Osmer nodded. And what about the enemy? The general said. My scouts say the base is still being defended by Shrike mercenaries, but I have no solid numbers. Neither do we, Robert confessed. But I do know a base like this will have hundreds of personnel. Between 600 to 900 people will be stationed inside. Good news for us, though, only a few of them will be armed. Most of the people in the base will be workers, the team working on those cruisers, or the machine in the VAB, or the scientists doing the sick experiments on those children. Piper nodded. She and Corsair had brought back enough evidence to raise the alarm during their first foray into Canaveral. The subsequent trips, done over the past few weeks, delivered photographs, videos, and even a secret interview with one of the alien children. In a 2-minute clip, a Partogan child explained how he was abducted from Rotorua and desperately wanted to go home. Piper made multiple copies of the file, hoping it would one day be used in a war crimes tribunal. Piper's only regret was failing to make contact with Inez Espinosa during these repeated visits. Despite never actually seeing her, Piper had good reason to believe Inez was physically present in the base during at least one of the infiltrations. First things first, Piper said. We have to break into Canaveral and shut down whatever operation Freeman is running in there. Nothing else matters. Even if that means crossing an enemy-controlled river with no advanced reconnaissance? General Osmer asked. Surely there must be a better way. All of the better ways take time, Lawrence concluded. We need to act now. I'll go with you, Emmanuel said. I've been to Canaveral a couple of times while they were setting up. I can show the way. July 21st, 2086. Titusville, Florida. About 3 hours before the sun rose, in the pitch darkness of early morning, Lawrence, Jay, Piper, and Sarah found themselves on the western side of the Indian River, staring down the NASA Causeway Bridge. Lawrence scanned the scene with a pair of binoculars and quickly spotted the checkpoint on the far side. Piper told him it would be there. With a shudder, Lawrence looked out of the corner of his eye and spotted Piper. Just like her 3 fellow Wolverines, the young woman was dressed in gorilla fatigues, with a blue bandana tied around her forehead to tell friend from foe. This would be the first time all 4 Wolverines stood together on a battlefield since the Battle of Saginaw, where Piper had gone over to the other side. In the very back of his mind, Lawrence was worried that Piper might betray her allies a second time. Turning around, Lawrence spoke to a group of American officers. Inez Espinosa was among them, clutching a map of Cape Canaveral in his hand. "We're ready," he said. "Put up the smokescreen and wait until the bridge is completely obscured before crossing." The Americans nodded and returned to their troops. Scattered throughout the attacking force were 5 mech troopers, robotic warriors left over from the last war. Each unit had a rotary grenade launcher attached to its back, where it functioned like a mortar. At the same time, all 5 of the mech troopers crouched down, took aim with their launchers, and opened fire. 5 heavy smoke bombs tumbled down onto the far side of the bridge and detonated. Swirling white gas filled the air, and in a matter of seconds caught the wind. The bridge was completely obscured, and it was impossible for anyone on the far side to see if someone was crossing the river. Lawrence raised a whistle to his lips and blew. It was the signal. Just under 150 men and women, all armed with an array of weapons, gathered at the western end of the bridge and set out, following behind a huge metal automaton. Leading the charge across the causeway was a 50-year-old sectopod. This was a bipedal robot that stood nearly 20 feet in height and carried 2 devastating weapon systems on its head. During the Second Hyperspace War, sectopods were a terrifying sight to behold, and just one could put an elite XCOM squad to flight. Of course, newer, more modern sectopods existed in the present day, but nearly all of them were busy fighting the Galactic Defense Force on other planets. Lawrence had ruled out any chance of seeing a UN sectopod this morning. The mixed force of Americans and aliens pressed forward, reaching the far side of the bridge and taking full control of the checkpoint located there. To Lawrence's alarm, it was empty. There were no guards to be found. Emmanuel, shaken but still full of resolve, led the way further inland. With the beachhead secured, the attacking force started to fan out, taking control of the NASA Parkway. From here, there was half a mile of flat, marshy ground until the next landmark, the shattered ruins of the Kennedy Space Center Visitor Complex, a massive structure that was leveled to the ground in the previous war. From here, in the early morning darkness, it was possible to see the only remaining structure, a replica of Saturn 1B, one of humanity's primitive first attempts at building a spacecraft. Clutching a laser rifle close to his chest, Lawrence waited for directions from Emmanuel, then signaled the attack group to move out. The old sectopod led the way, each of its footfalls shaking the ground with a deep, booming sound. Everyone was on edge. They knew stealth was impossible with a sectopod in their ranks. The only option was the brute force approach, to smash through with heavy weapons and overwhelm the garrison. Then they would just have to hold the Cape until General Osmer could deliver reinforcements. Knowing that friendly Americans were on the way was a boon to the tiny force of attackers. Everyone pressed on, marching into the darkness until there was a crack of gunfire. Gauss slugs flew high over Lawrence's head. "Contact front!" Lawrence yelled. Rifles were raised, and one of the Americans fired a flare gun. Night turned into day, revealing the enemy. Several dozen members of Shrike, in full black and red uniform, were hiding in the marsh, weapons at the ready. A storm of gunfire erupted as both sides laid into each other. The sectopod stepped off the road and into the swamp, opening its upper hatch to deploy its railgun. Mech troopers and Andromedons opened fire with heavy plasma weapons, while one of the mutons turned his head to the sky and roared like a primal beast. Hearing their brother's blood call, the other mutons were stirred into a frenzy and were soon out of control, closing the distance to the enemy and opening fire with powerful shotguns. While the American soldiers fanned out, 10 Levakian hunters slinked into the tall grass and soon vanished from sight. It was a desperate and chaotic fight. The Shrike mercenaries were trying to engage from as far away as possible, and every time the Americans got closer than about 100 yards, the mercenaries would break contact and wage a fighting retreat. Too small to carry a rifle, Sarah was fighting with a coil gun, a magnetic submachine gun. She aimed toward strike positions and held the trigger down until her weapon ran out of ammunition. She never hit anything, but this was a good way to stop Shrike from poking their heads out of cover. Whenever Sarah paused to reload, the enemy soldiers she was engaging sprang up and ran away. "We've got him on the run!" yelled the voice of Colonel Sharp. He was on the far left flank, leading a squad of 10 ancient Americans. "Keep pushing!" Looking to his right, Lawrence could see his force had now drawn level with the visitor center ruins. Looking down, he spotted the body of a Shrike mercenary, the first and so far only fatality of the night. Lawrence opened his mouth and started to raise his voice to give words of encouragement to the troops, but then Crew Chief Magra shouted, "Look to the horizon! 2 o'clock! What is that?" Lawrence, Sarah, Piper, and Jay all turned their heads to look. They saw a dark shape on the horizon. Jay was the first person to recognize it, and he screamed. "Sectopod!" Jay hollered. "Sectopod at our 2 o'clock!" At once, the Americans began to panic. Soldiers dropped into the prone position, trying to hide. Others blindly fired their weapons in the direction Jay pointed out. The American sectopod stepped forward and fired its railgun towards the foe. A bolt split the sky like lightning, and there was a deafening crash. The UN sectopod staggered and took a few steps forward. "Heavy weapons!" Lawrence shouted. "Bring up the anti-armor kit!" Several Americans, mutons, and mech troopers came forward carrying heavy weapons. A shoulder-mounted blaster launcher lit up the battlefield in sickly shades of green before the plasma projectile made contact with the enemy robot. Unfortunately, it was a glancing blow. The enemy sectopod staggered again before resuming its own attack. A railgun blast ripped through the American line, sending blood and mud flying across the marsh. A Levakian grabbed a blaster launcher, took aim, and sent another round flying downrange. This time, it was a direct hit. A dense cloud of black smoke obscured the enemy from view, leaving only the initial group of mercenaries to fight, at least for the moment. Lawrence ran up and down the line, trying to find out how badly his force was hit. 5 Americans were dead, plus a muton and one of the Levakians. Lawrence found Colonel Sharp. "Ridge!" Sharp yelled. "I've got 30 wounded over here. We've got to stop!" "No, sir! Can't stop here!" Lawrence replied. "This is a killing field!" Sharp tried to reply, but Sarah and Piper's voices, high and shrill, pierced the night. "Left side! We're being flanked!" The enemy sectopod had reappeared. The 20-foot-high robot was stalking the left flank, taking disturbingly wide strides that carried it hundreds of feet in a matter of seconds. Cursing loudly, Piper grabbed a blaster launcher. Ignoring the bullets and beams filling the air around her, Piper stood, fully erect, with the rocket launcher on her shoulder, and then took the shot. The blaster launcher kicked so hard that it flew backwards out of her hands and sent the petite woman crashing to the ground. The plasma projectile sailed high and missed the sectopod by a wide margin. The enemy robot turned to face the direction the attack came from. "Oh, fuck, scatter!" Lawrence yelled. The enemy sectopod fired a blast from its railgun. At once, the American sectopod exploded. Its body was rent into many bits and pieces, while the 2 legs toppled to the ground with great muddy thuds. Before Lawrence could do or say anything, both the UN sectopod and the mercenaries opened fire again. Deadly weapon fire raked the Americans and their alien allies. Soldiers fell into the dark marsh, never to be seen again. "Retreat!" Lawrence yelled. "Everyone fall back to the bridge!" Colonel Sharp echoed. The attacking force broke contact and ran back the way they came. By now, the sun was starting to rise. A deep, crimson stained the sky and the marsh below, so that Lawrence looked as though he was running through a sea of blood. Desperate to escape, weapons and armor were abandoned. Even the gravely injured were left behind, including... "We lost Espinosa!" Piper yelled from somewhere near the back of the line. "He's been captured!" "What?" Lawrence replied. "He got hit," Jay said. "Shot in the arm. He went down, and we had to leave him behind. The bastards came and plucked him right off the ground. They got him!" There was nothing to be done. Praying to Jericho that Emmanuel would be safe in UN custody, Lawrence pressed on, running full tilt to the river. After running the longest half-mile of his life, Lawrence reached the checkpoint before the NASA Causeway Bridge. Except the bridge was gone. Concrete pylons stuck out of the river in regular intervals, as if taunting the fleeing guerrillas. The shattered remains of the attack force reached the river and were equally dumbfounded by Lawrence's discovery. "Where's the bridge?" Sarah cried out in panic. "What happened?" "They blew it," Piper breathed. "I didn't think they would. They actually blew up the bridge!" Pops and snaps from above signaled renewed gunfire. The enemy was closing. "Swim for it!" Lawrence yelled. He tossed aside his laser rifle and ran towards the point where the road ended. Seeing they had no choice, Sarah, Piper, Jay, Carfu, Magra, and Colonel Sharp followed suit. Dozens of Americans and aliens did the same. The surviving members of the attack force jumped into the Indian River. The water was cold and the current slow. Each stroke Lawrence took towards Titusville took him a little further downstream, but he had no time to think about this. Behind him, the first members of Shrike were reaching the riverbank. Horrid snapping sounds told Lawrence that the enemy was shooting at him and his troops as they swam for their lives. Gauss rounds, laser beams, and plasma bolts made horrid sounds as they hit the water around him. Levakians, Partogans, and humans all cried out as they were shot. "Keep going! We can make it!" Piper yelled. "Carry the wounded between two people!" Jay instructed. "It's not that far! Keep swimming!" From here, with his head just barely above water, it looked as though the far shoreline was an eternity away. His arms and legs ached, his body winded, and his morale was sapped. For the briefest of moments, Lawrence considered giving up. But then, the sound of Jay's voice behind him gave Lawrence new strength. "Jay has a kid. You should at least make sure that boy's dad gets to go home." Lawrence raised his voice and called out to his troops, "Follow my voice! Stay with me!" Kicking with newfound vigor, Lawrence guided the way through the early morning light, and by the time the sun had fully risen, 40 men, women, and aliens washed ashore on the safe side of the river.